I met Bryn Davidson in the summer of 2006 in Vancouver as part of a day-long planning project looking at scenarios for how peak oil would affect that area of the world. It was a brilliant exercise, and I was really impressed by your simplification of the matrix of, if it's a fast decline, a slow decline, whether we really act actively, proactively, or reactively. Just that got me thinking in new ways. You use scenarios to have us think about our urban areas in a new way. Tell me about it.
Well, I think scenarios, they're really important tools in terms of opening up the dialogue, because so often a lot of people talking about peak oil or even climate change, they'll present one idea of the future that's maybe disastrous or not, but often that can be met by people as a kind of wall of, okay, oh, I don't want to listen to this. But if you can phrase something in terms of scenarios and then lay out the assumptions behind those, people can kind of form their own minds and they can be engaged in the dialogue. And I've found that this is really a powerful way to deal with skeptical audiences, but also audiences like energy traders or other people who are coming at it from a sort of different point of view. So I think there are a number of different ways to use scenarios. So on top of using them just as a dialogue tool, though, I think they also are going to be a really important part of how we start to actually do planning. And when I look at peak oil and climate change, which are these two sort of fundamentally game-changing sort of forces that are creating a lot of uncertainty. Like, they're obviously the underlying force we understand is there, but the impacts of what's going to happen, there's a wide range of uncertainty, and this is very unusual compared to what we've experienced the last 100 years. So when I look at how we have to plan and design our cities going forward in this coming century, I think we need to use scenarios a lot more to start really testing, is this a good strategy? Is this something we should be doing? I think especially when we're looking at how we build the infrastructure and the kind of nuts and bolts of our cities. And I say that because these are the things that last a long time. Like you might get a new television, or a new computer. This technology updates very quickly. Even the fleet of cars, we could turn over the car fleet relatively quickly. But the things that we're putting in the ground and the patterns that we're creating in terms of our transportation, land use, these are things that are going to be here for the next 40, the next maybe even 100 years. And so it's really important to understand that much of the stuff that we're building today is going to be serving us, it's going to be serving our kids, it's going to be serving our grandkids in a future that's constrained by oil and constrained by whatever kind of changing climate we bring about.
So you would be having to think in your scenarios, for example, if there's a sea level rise, or if we're running out of other resources. I mean, is that part of what you put into your scenario planning?
Absolutely. So we've been looking at trying to create scenarios that combine the impacts of both peak oil and climate change. Because in some ways they can have the similar impacts. When you look at food supply, both peak oil and climate change could potentially have a negative impact on the availability of food. In other ways, they're very different from each other, and it's important to really understand the distinctions between the two. But we are looking at scenarios that look at oil price, that look at immigration, sea level rise, all these other kind of things, to try and get a good sense of if we're going to spend, billions of dollars on something, is a highway expansion maybe the best way to spend it, or could we spend it on something that pays us back in any future, as opposed to only paying us back in a future that's sort of an extrapolation of what we had experienced in the past.
Actually, that makes me think that someone here at the conference said something like, we may be at peak roads. We may have already built as many roads as we probably need for a time, and we need to be thinking about something that uses less petroleum, obviously.
Yeah, so I think in doing the scenario planning modeling that we've been looking at, we've been looking specifically at transportation, because that's what peak oil is really going to hit first. And we also see all these highway expansion projects going on. And often the reason that people are saying that we need to build these highway expansion projects is because there are these projections into the future for container traffic, for trucks, for cars, all of this stuff. And when we look at peak oil and climate change, we feel that really a lot of these are I don't know, I'd say they're delusional, maybe that sounds a bit extreme, but I think they are like highly questionable. And so I think we need to start looking at least another model for what could happen if that growth in transport demand can't happen because there simply isn't enough fuel to run that.
It sounds to me, as you pointed out in your talk, those projections are based on an assumption that we will continue to have oil the way we have had oil.
Yeah.
And people are needing alternate numbers that say, well, what if we really are declining at 1 or 2 or 3 or 5% a year?
Yeah, absolutely. And there's nobody to date that's really been doing this type of modeling, at least on the transportation side. Because in the past, all we had to go on was, what's happened in the past. And it's hard to get around that because there's so much inertia in all of our institutions, and, all the engineers, they go to the economists, and the economists look at what's happened. And for 60 or 100 years, that growth has been pretty consistent. And so that's a pretty, at least in their minds, compelling argument that it should keep on going. But once you've really internalized the impact of peak oil and or climate change, then you start to question these things. And so we start to look at what's the availability of fuel, and then we bundle together all of the different strategies for things that we can do. Those are alternative fuels, electrification, vehicle fuel efficiency, and we put all those together and we say, okay, this is how many trucks we think can actually run. Even after we've done all of these mitigation strategies. So we say, okay, in 2020, instead of being 50% up like they're claiming, it looks like it's plausible that we could be driving 10% less. And so it's not about saying, I know absolutely what's going to happen in the future, but here are 3 plausible scenarios for the future that are potentially very different from each other. And the question then is, where do we spend money today in a way that pays us back in all 3 futures? Because right now, if we invest in highway infrastructure and that transportation use doesn't actually materialize, we will have created a stranded asset. And so I think right now there is the potential that we're spending a lot of money on things that will have very little value in the future. And so when I think of all the things that need to be done, I really see this as the major place that we can shift money and everything else from something that's a stranded asset to something that is much more critical to creating a sort of resilient post-carbon economy.
Bryn, here we are on a day, this is September 22nd, in which the gas prices, the oil prices have just shot up way beyond it has for decades. Has your scenarios taken a look at things like sudden changes and shocks like that?
Yeah, well, the scenarios operate kind of at 2 levels. On one hand, we're looking at sort of long-term trends, and then the other is, okay, what happens in the short terms in terms of what types of shocks could happen and how do we respond to those. So we've actually come up with a kind of mapping system looking at a range of climate shocks and also a range of energy shocks and showing, okay, this is how it'll unfold. First these smaller shocks and then these larger ones. And we're trying to figure out how do we actually use these shocks as catalysts for proactive responses as opposed to sort of reactive ones, which can often be counterproductive. So I think there's, to an extent, the scenarios are trying to operate at 2 levels. In terms of the recent price increases, I'd say that anybody who's been involved in the peak oil dialogue hasn't been surprised by this. And I feel like if more decision makers had been involved and were reaching a higher level of, say, energy literacy, and we had a broader discussion about how some of these shocks could unfold, then we wouldn't be acting with such surprise and turmoil. So I think that's a big part of what we're going to have to do. But I think in the long term, as we look at the energy transition, we have to understand that there's going to be 2 sort of bundles of solutions. One are the kind of long-term investments in sort of big changes, and the other are these sort of ad hoc sort of quick changes that we can make. When we look at what happened to Cuba with the sort of rapid collapse of their oil supply, they had all these ad hoc strategies, and I think there's a lot that can be learned there. And I think when we look at our cities, things like carpooling and some of these other things can actually scale up very quickly. While at the same time we're doing long-term things, which is building the streetcars, changing our patterns of land use, all these other things, which will have to unfold over a longer period of time.
Great. Bryn, thank you. Thank you for bringing these kind of tools and this kind of perspective. We're going to need a lot more of it in the next decades to come. Thanks for starting it out for us.
Well, thanks for your work.
Okay.